Do you remember sitting at the kids' table? I loved the kids' table, but there was always a lingering eagerness to graduate to the adults' table, right? Where daunting, important conversations were being held. Maybe you got to the big kids' table before the adults' table, where it became less about discovering the world, but exploring it. Then when you finally got to the adults' table, maybe you didn't know what to do, what you're hearing, what to say, how to act, what the rules were. We were present. We were there, finally. We knew what was going on, but our voices seemed to fade into the background of grown-up affairs. From protests to policies, young people are rewriting the rules of civic engagement by standing at the forefront of campaigns calling for change: environmental, social, political, personal. And while the scope of these efforts is incredibly varied, at least one common thread can be woven through them all: the demand for inclusion in decision-making processes, the demand for a voice in the conversation. But the unfortunate reality is that these are efforts of the exception, not the rule. In fact, academic observations have shown young people's civic knowledge and voter participation to be declining for years. Observations that, in the day-to-day, have been twisted into an unfair generalization of a generation as apathetic. But apathy, among a lot of other words thrown around today to describe a young person, conveniently ignores certain structural factors that bring about the alienation of young people from civic processes. Among these, the systemic indifference towards a valuable demographic of perspectives. But this isn't necessarily the fault of any leader or party. Instead, the incentivizing mechanisms of our political system just does not see the point in prioritizing the concerns of those who cannot vote yet. Or more importantly, when they can, are less likely to vote because of these lived senses of alienation and detachment and exclusion. So by the time a young person, this circular course all acts as a further disincentive from participating because what's the point? But I've seen the problem to be just as circular as the mechanism that drives it. It should be no surprise that there are issues whose effects are disproportionately felt by young people. But in deciding just how to perceive and approach these issues, these systemic gaps make it so that such essential input is blocked from ever getting to the table. And decisions made today will be felt by young people inheriting the world tomorrow. So by the time an 18-year-old has actually gained the power to vote, this lived separation has resulted in what is, you can see, overly simplistically called disinterest. But it's definitely easier to say that all we care about are likes and reshares, and we're just too lazy, and we're addicted to our phones, obsessed with TikTok and the Kardashians. Young people have different interests and habits than youth of previous generations. But to use that as the reason for explaining widespread decreased levels of civic participation, that is what's lazy. Because it is easier to complain that young people are disengaged than acknowledge that most are never given the chance nor the tools to be engaged in the first place. So I prefer to propose solutions in the form of a process, a step-by-step guide, a global citizenship blueprint. Starting from the top, global engagement. The seeds to which are planted young is the goal, raising global citizens who first and foremost have an awareness, a general understanding of the world beyond our own perspectives. How do we go about empowering young people to be global citizens? by starting at home. Zero in on domestic engagement by addressing the provision of information, opportunities for involvement and mobilization, and paying attention to overlooked or assumed perspectives. These are the giving of the tools, but how are they exercised? Through the vote. As a young person with the right tools, the proper understanding and appreciation of the act, the options, and the consequences, voting is the basic function that can be an empowering demonstration of making your voice heard. This is achieved through the twin track of information and practice. For young people, the vote is the seat at the table, but we need to understand that it is waiting for us to sit down. We need to realize that the vote does hold power if you use it. Building domestically engaged citizens lays the foundation for aware and informed young global citizens who will not hesitate when it becomes their turn to lead the world, through whatever function, in whatever sphere. Involving youth in civic mechanisms begins the process of raising lifelong participants in global processes and constructive citizens. And it starts with information. In 2019, when I was in grade 10, my high school history teacher chose to dedicate the first 3 weeks of her course to a primer on government. As a student in secondary 4, I was 15, I got to look forward to taking a standardized exam on the history of Quebec and Canada by the Ministry of Education at the end of the year. So I thought, why would our teacher push back material needed for this standardized exam for content that we didn't need for it? It's because 2019 was an election year. As we began our school term, federal party leaders hoping to become the next Prime Minister of Canada were beginning their journeys on the campaign trail. Our class learned the basics of government and applied them to real life. We had an assignment based off of watching the leaders debate, for example. Our teacher believed it was important for us to have a base knowledge of government and of politics to filter the news about upcoming federal election developments through, even if we were not voting. In 3 weeks, she covered the structure of Parliament, what a riding was, who the different federal parties were, what ideas they represented, how to find and read a party's platform, how the vote works in our electoral system, what is an electoral system, and so on. But here's what's important. If you could imagine the students in our class in 2019, you could arrange us on a spectrum, where on one end were those who, not necessarily through any fault of their own, really couldn't have cared less, who listened to grasp the bare minimum needed to complete the assignments and receive a decent grade. And on the other end were those who absorbed the material in a more substantive sense. Feel free to take a wild guess as to where I ended up. But at the end of that introduction, whether we were just going through the motions or had identified our future careers, we all had a better idea of what we were hearing or not hearing from the leaders' debate. We all built a better understanding of the system we live our day-to-day in. And 2-3 years later, when it was our turn to vote, we all knew what we were doing and why it mattered. So in a slightly pessimistic way, forcing even the most basic primer on students can, at the very least, increase their understanding of processes they are embedded in as citizens, and at most, increase their likelihood to cast an informed vote. Civic education is not a universal requirement in school curricula, but it has to be. In my case, this was a choice that our teacher took upon herself to make. We know that schools are vessels of empowerment that supply us with information that we carry into our lives, consciously or not. Just as we learned how to add, subtract, and multiply, schools can introduce us to and teach us how to navigate the functions that we will be faced with as citizens with a stake in the future. But information and education are only the half of it. Voting boils down to habit forming. And this is one of the key arguments in lowering the voting age. If young people can vote earlier, the more likely they are to form the consistent habit and practice. But we all know you can form bad habits. Just lowering the voting age fails to address the fundamental components of information, without which votes that are cast risk potentially not being representative of the young voters' true preferences, or there's just no vote at all. And equally, the provision of information fails to address the fundamental component of habit forming. So these are essentially linked, but how do we go about tackling practice? Simulations address habit forming in a practical way and can be implemented into schools or outside. One case in point is les petits bureaux de vote, or little polling stations. In some Quebec ridings, children can tag along with their parents to the ballot box, where they are familiarized with the process of receiving, ticking off, and returning the ballot after watching their parents, at which point they get to go to their own petit bureau. Following their parents' procedural example, they get to vote on a question made for them, like, what do you think makes a good friend? A, B, C, D. And understanding that civic engagement goes beyond casting the ballot, results are made available afterwards to be accessed by parents and kids. The point is to mimic the real voting process with as little interruption to the official one as possible. Now, for older youth who have already been introduced to the basics of government through their schools, election simulations held in high schools extend the opportunity to practice off of that knowledge. Classes can set up a ballot box, elect a chief returning officer, and vote on ballots with the official candidates of the riding the school is located in, to practice voting, having learned what we're voting for and why it is important. This twin track is a step towards filling the gaps through which the interests and voices of tomorrow's contributing citizens and dynamic leaders fall through. And when we implement the twin track into the broader framework of the global citizen, it becomes a step towards including young people in the processes of a world that they will come to inherit. A step towards a world where we do not dread our positions in the future, but we invite and welcome the chance to fill them. Like any other citizen, understanding the importance of the vote, we use it as leverage to be heard and recognized. This is the structural effect felt in addition to the informal modes of participation we have seen, like protests as forms of pressure. As citizens, we give our leaders a reason to pay attention. Empowerment is the underlying effect. With the tools of critical thinking and information, feeling represented and engaged incentivizes us to pay attention, to remain engaged, nurturing a broader awareness that expands beyond our narrow, comfortable bubbles. And youth are not a black box. Not every young person has the same ideas and preferences. Not all youth are necessarily left-leaning. But the point is to be opened up to those democratic mechanisms to allow the translation of those growing preferences into impact. To their credit, institutions, parties, and leaders may realize that there exists a problematic gap of youth participation, and some have made efforts to address it, to boost engagement. But just like it's too simple to say that things like the Kardashians and TikTok are the reasons blocking youth engagement, it's too simple to say that this will change it. Be it through the vote or other outlets, a young person cannot fulfill their potential without the opportunity, without the chance to be heard. As we witness a changing global landscape, it's time to realize that youth are not just the leaders of tomorrow, but the architects of an enriched world today. Because remember, after spending some time at the adults' table, we all eventually found our footing. We didn't just listen along in silence. We began to start the daunting, important conversations. This is Gen Next. It is by giving youth a seat at the table, a stake in the game, a microphone, that they may be introduced to the processes of a world which they will come to inherit, a system where their efforts and their actions will shape the future. Because our perspectives as global citizens, our interests, our voices, our ideas are worth spreading. Thank you.